The final topic from Chapter 3 I want to introduce is the idea of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Consumer surplus measures the differences between the price paid and the maximum willingness to pay for each unit traded. Graphically, this is represented by the area below demand and above the price, but we'll get to the graph in just a minute. A nice example. 2 summers ago, I was teaching a class, and we had these straight line winds come through town, knock down a bunch of trees, which took out the power lines in my neighborhood. So I knew going to bed that our power was out. When I woke up the next morning, the power was still out, and I'm not very much of a morning person. So of course I got up, put the water and the coffee in the coffee pot, turned it on, and then said, oh yeah, the power's out, I can't make coffee. So I said, that's fine, I've got extra time, I'll go to Starbucks on my way into work, but Starbucks also did not have coffee. So then I was getting desperate and noticed that down the road the Quick Trip had lights on. So I drove to the Quick Trip, had to fight an angry mob of these women that all had their Century insurance tags on to get to the coffee pot, and it wasn't very good coffee. I think they were making it as fast as they could and forgot to put some of the coffee in. And so I got my cup of coffee, and I'm standing there really jonesing for my coffee, and I have $20 in my pocket. And I thought I would be willing to pay my entire $20 bill to buy this cup of coffee right now. But I only had to pay like $1. So the fact that I was willing to sacrifice $20 worth of other things, but only had to pay $1, that frees up $19 that I could be using to buy something else that I would have been willing to sacrifice for the coffee. And that's what we mean by consumer surplus. So if we look at this on a graph, suppose we know what the price and quantity are and where we are located along the demand curve. For the person that's willing to pay the highest amount to buy their cup of coffee, they're this person right here, and they get this big consumer surplus, this big difference between the maximum price they would have been willing to pay and the price they actually paid. And then there's another consumer that's willing to pay almost as much, and they get this big distance in consumer surplus, and then the next consumer, and so on and so on. So when we add together the consumer surplus for all buyers in the market, we're going to get the area of this triangle. So if we had numbers associated with this, so if we knew what number was right up here, and we knew what number was here, and we knew the quantity demanded here, we could calculate the consumer surplus, remembering from our math classes that the area of the triangle would be 1/2 the base of the triangle. Sorry for my really, really bad handwriting. So the base would be essentially this distance down here, which would be measured by how big the quantity demanded is, times the height of the triangle. So the height of the triangle, we would need to know both of these values to figure out how tall our triangle is. And we could measure then the total consumer surplus for all consumers that buy the product. On Econ Portal, they have a couple questions that are confusing in terms of the wording, but when you draw the picture, it's actually not as confusing as they make it sound. So suppose that we start off with a price of $10 and a quantity demanded of 10 units, and then the price falls to $5, and that causes us to move along the demand curve, and now we have a higher quantity demanded of 15. And these questions ask us, how big is the gain in consumer surplus? So our original consumer surplus would be equal to the area of this triangle here. How much did consumer surplus go up? We would have this big funny area down here. So in order to calculate this area, we're going to separate it into, we've got a rectangle right here, and we've got a triangle. And we're looking at those two areas together. So for the rectangle, we've got a height of 5 and a base of 10. So the area of the rectangle would be 5 times 10 equals 50. And then for the triangle, again, we have a height of 5, and here we have a base of 5. So the area of the triangle, we would have 1/2 the base of 5 times the height of 5. So 1/2 of 25, which would be 12.5. And so we add those two areas together to find that consumer surplus has gone up by 62.5. Now, in the learning curve problems that have this, they don't always show you the graph. They just kind of give you the starting and ending prices and quantities. But if you draw the graph out, you can easily figure out these two areas and how much consumer surplus has grown. Or if we were moving in the opposite direction, how much consumer surplus has gone down. The wording on these questions talks about, well, for the 10 consumers that were willing to buy it at the price of $10, they all get an extra $5 of consumer surplus. So 5 times 10, that gives us this 50 area. And then they have some odd wording about the average willingness to pay for these extra consumers that are lured into buying the good. Well, it's easier to just think about this in terms of the graph. The extra consumer surplus gained by the 5 consumers that are now willing to buy the product would give us the area of this triangle. Similarly, we also have the concept of producer surplus. So producer surplus measures the difference between the price received, that the seller receives for selling the product, and the lowest or minimum price they would have been willing to accept for each unit that gets traded. And graphically, this is represented by the area below price and above supply. So if we look at a supply curve and we know the price and quantity and where we're located along the supply curve, our most efficient seller would be willing to sell the product for a fairly low price, but they receive the much higher market price that we see here. And so that difference would be their producer surplus. And then the producer that's next most efficient would have a unit that they would be willing to sell at a slightly higher price. They get a little less producer surplus. And we keep adding up these vertical distances. And again, we're going to end up measuring for all of the goods traded. The producer surplus would give us the area of this triangle. So that wraps up the lecture materials from Chapter 3. Our next segment is going to look at Chapter 4, where we put supply and demand together.